Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is now episode 47 of the podcast Afford with myself, Brother Mahdi Locke, author of The Big Step. And today, inshallah, we will be looking at this topic of Islam and traditions, or Islam and culture. This is going to be a follow-up of the video I just posted by Imam Muhammad Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti, rahimahullah, about quote-unquote Islamic traditions and how we should not refer to our deen as a set of traditions. We shouldn't call prayer, for example, an Islamic tradition, or Hajj an Islamic tradition, or we shouldn't call it the heritage of our fathers and grandfathers, or parents and grandparents. So, and this was part of what he was saying, was simply part of a larger statement that he made in his book Fiqh, as-Seerah, which I have on my blog. I published it a few years ago, and I added some notes. So that's what I want to go in today to look at in detail. Excuse me if you hear the clicking of the mouse, but let us proceed. So this blog post is called Islam is Revelation, Not a Race or Culture. That's what it's called. And the subtitle is Why Islam Should Not Be Conflated with Race or Referred to as a Set of quote-unquote traditions. So the Imam says in his book Fiqh as-Seerah, now I've based it on the translation that Dar al-Fiqh provided in 2008, pages 144 to 146. In the 2009 Arabic edition, this is found on pages 114 to 116. So, the Imam starts off and he says, third, because he's giving a list of reasons, which you can look at the context in the book itself. He says this: the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, took his people to task for enslaving themselves to traditions that they had inherited from their forefathers without giving thought to how valid or invalid they might be. He called upon them to free their minds from the habit of blind obedience and bigoted attachment to traditions which are not based upon a foundation of sound reason. This, in turn, serves as evidence that the underpinning for this religion is, in both its theology and ruling, is none other than the intellect and reason. That the aim behind adherence to it is the best interests of mankind in this life and the next. Hence, one of the most important conditions for the soundness of one's faith in Allah and whatever other beliefs are associated with this is that such faith rests on a foundation of certainty and free thought, unrestrained by convention or tradition. The author of Jawharat al-Tawheed, which is a creed text by Imam al-Laqani, very famous, taught throughout the Muslim world, especially places like Morocco and Egypt, like the Qarawiyyin, al-Azhar. The Imam says in his well-known poem, if one just imitates, if one just mimics others in the oneness of Allah, his faith has not been freed of redundancy, taradid, right? So tawheed and taradid, redundancy. So there's two things to take away from this. Number one, what he's getting at here, and it's a bit of a side note, is that there's no taqleed in theology. In terms of, when we hear taqleed, is actually imitating someone, following a scholar. So, and this is the difference between fiqh and theology. In fiqh, it's perfectly valid to say, yeah, I place my hands above the navel because Imam an-Nawawi says so. I place my hands at the sides because that's the mashhur position of the Maliki school, or whatever it is. Or I don't pay zakat on gold jewelry because that's what Imam Muhammad ibn Qudama says. That's perfectly valid. That's fiqh. But in theology, in your basic theology, no. That's from the book and the sunnah directly. You don't say, oh, Allah is one because Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal said so. The Day of Judgment is true because Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi said so. No. You have to believe in these things because you've actually read them directly in the Quran or the sunnah. You've read them directly. You're not going through a scholar here. So you have to believe. What you believe has to be in your heart, has to come from you. You can't be following people in your foundational theology. That's the first point. The second point that comes up here. And this is why I would recommend listeners read an article I posted recently, a few weeks back, called The Scientific Method for Researching Truth, which is the translation of chapter 1 of Imam Muhammad Saeed Ramadan's theology text, Kubra al-Yaqinat al-Kawniyah, also known as the Greatest Universal Sureties. And in this article, because people might be getting confused listening to this, because he's talking about intellect and reason, what he shows in this article, which is chapter 1 of his theology text, interesting, chapter 1 of his theology text, is he goes into epistemology and shows how do we as Muslims ascertain whether or not something is true, and how do the Orientalists and Westerners in general, how do they do it? And what he shows, very, very skillfully and deftly, shows that we Muslims have a scientific method. We have a clear scientific method for verifying whether or not something is true, whether or not an event actually happened, whether or not a statement was actually made. Westerners don't have a method. A lot of it is guesswork. A lot of it is merely just anticipation, imagination, whatever suits their fancy. They theorize, and then they look for stuff. They look for pieces of evidence, quote-unquote evidence, to back up their theory. Their method is all over the place. They don't have a fixed scientific method, whereas we do. And that's why when Imam al-Bouti is talking about how our faith rests firmly in sound intellect and reason, this is what he's talking about. So if you're going to read this article, Islam's Revelation, Not a Race or Culture, and read these first few paragraphs, cross-reference it with this other article, which is from another book of his called The Scientific Method for Researching Truth. So I will link this below, inshallah. So the Imam continues. After this statement from Imam al-Laqani, he continues and he says, from this, it becomes clear that the religion of Islam came to declare war on traditions insofar as they arise from blind mimicry, since this religion, in all its principles and rulings, is based on the foundation of sound intellect and reason, while traditions, quote-unquote, in this sense, are founded on nothing but the desire to imitate and follow, that is, without any role being given to the element of inquiry and independent thinking. After all, the word taqalid, singular taqlid, because I'm using two different words. You remember, taqlid, when we talk about fiqh and usul, this means to imitate and follow scholars, right? When we talk about it outside, and just in a purely linguistic sense, it tends to mean just traditions, customs, habits, and so forth. So after all, the word taqalid means, according to the scholars of the Arabic language and social scientists, i.e. not in fiqh, the sum total of the customs which have been inherited from former generations, or which maintain their validity simply by virtue of the social contract which takes place in our particular environment. As such, the element of sheer imitation is the central nerve which extends through such customs, giving them both life and enabling them to survive. So in plain English, what he's saying is Islam came to declare war on traditions that have absolutely no basis apart from the fact that they've been passed on. They've been passed on from generation to generation for maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years, maybe 1,000 years, but their only claim to validity is that they've been passed on. They don't have a revelatory source. They don't have a source in basic logic and common sense. They're just done simply because they've been passed on. People say, I did it because my dad taught me, and his dad taught him, and his dad taught him, and that's it. That's the only reason these things survive. The Imam continues. He says, everything people have grown accustomed to in their societies, ways of life, the forms of entertainment they engage in during times of happiness, and how they express mourning in times of misfortune and sadness, is part of what has been handed down from times of old, or what has been adopted unthinkingly through influence or contact with others, and is all these things together, which are referred to by both linguists and sociologists as traditions, quote unquote. So this is what he's talking about. How do people get married? At times of happiness. How do people celebrate weddings? How do people celebrate, or if they do, people celebrate birthdays. People express in times of mournings, he says express mourning in times of misfortune, sadness. How do people celebrate funerals? Well, celebrate funerals. How do people hold funerals? How do they arrange them? How do people dress? But these are things to think about. So for example, it's very, very common in, say, the Anglosphere and in Europe to wear black at a funeral. That's a custom, to wear black at a funeral. Black is a mourning color. But is black a mourning color in Islam? Now, we look at, for example, the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that he wore a black amama, especially in battles, which would indicate what? That black is a color of victory. It's not a color of sadness. These are little subtle things that people don't think about. Little subtle things that people don't think about. And sometimes people make these mistakes. I remember once had an interesting discussion with someone who tried to argue that white is a Sunnah color and black is a Shia color, simply because people from that organization or that cult tend to wear black. Their leaders wear black. So that means that black is a color that Sunnis can't wear anymore. So you got to think about these things. Where do they come from? Imam al-Bouti continues. He says, once you know this, you realize that Islam cannot possibly contain anything by the name of traditions, whether they have to do with theology or various rulings and regulations, since the theology is based on the foundation of sound reasoning, while its rulings rest on the foundation of temporal and eternal interests. Although some interests might not be comprehended by some people for this reason or that, they are nevertheless understandable through thought and careful reflection. And again, when you think deeply about these matters and you realize that it all goes back to revelation, all goes back to the revelation of the book and the revelation of the Sunnah, and this is why you're told to do things. So even if you don't understand why you're doing something, for example, you don't know why are you praying 3 rak'at at Maghrib and 4 rak'at at Isha, even though you don't understand that, you trust in it because the source is revelation. You've been told to do this by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You've been told to pray by Allah in the Quran. So you don't have to worry about it. Ultimately, it's rooted in knowledge. It's rooted in firm, certain knowledge. Imam al-Bouti continues. He says, this in turn reveals the seriousness of the error committed by those who employ the phrase Islamic traditions to describe Islam's various forms of worship, legislative rulings, and moral precepts. The propagation of this unfair designation may suggest to people that the value of Islamically sanctioned morality derives not from its embodying a divine principle, which contains the secret of happiness for the human race, as in fact it does, but rather because the Islamic law and system of morality are customs which were inherited from previous generations. If this suggestion is taken seriously, it is bound to cause people to feel oppressed by this antiquated heritage, which others wish to impose on society, in which everything is highly developed, advanced, and modern. And this is the thing. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see discussions and articles, discussions on YouTube, people trying to talk about Islam. And obviously people who are not Muslim, unbelievers, they say it. But I've even seen Muslims saying it recently as well, saying people claim to be Muslim, saying, why do people want to stick to these 7th century traditions? Stick to the culture of 7th century Arabia. Study that statement. When someone says, "Oh, this is the religion of 7th century Arabia," the underlying assumption there, what's being implied, is that's all that Islam is. Islam is just something that appeared in the 7th century of Arabia, that was invented by human beings, not from Allah, was invented by human beings, and then was just passed down. And its only validity is that it's been passed down from generation to generation, century after century, and its origin is merely 7th century Arabian culture. But people talk like that. Even people who claim to be Muslims talk like that. And this is what happens when you start, because the point that Imam al-Bouti is making in his video is that the language you use affects the way you think. You have to keep that in mind. The language you use affects the way you think. That's what George Orwell's book 1984 was all about, or a large part of it was about that. But how can we control, if we want to control people's thoughts, We have to control people's language. And that's why, for example, in the book, the language that people are allowed to use is very, very restricted. You can't use synonyms for good and bad. You can't say awful, terrible, horrible, dreadful, disgusting, revolting. You can't say use synonyms for good. You can't say wonderful, fantastic, amazing, incredible, lovely, wonderful, splendid. You can't do that. Instead you have to say plus good, plus good, plus bad, and so forth. It's very, very crucial. The way you talk about something, the language you use affects the way you think. And again, I can also add on to that this is why there's another massive benefit of just knowing the Arabic language, because sometimes for the Anglosphere, you can hear a term in English, right? Someone gives you an expression or a buzzword or some soundbite in English, and you think nothing of it because you're just so used to the English language. But then you translate it into Arabic, and it's like, oh, wait a second. This isn't right. This is a bit over the top. How does this fit? So, for example, like people might say, okay, people use terms like revolution, right? Revolution. We need to have an Islamic revolution. People use these kind of words, right? And you're used to that in English. But then you put it into Arabic. What's the word in Arabic for revolution? It's like thawra. Thawra, which you look at the verb that comes from, it actually means, you look it up in the Hansard Dictionary, it means to fly into a rage. Does that sound Islamic to you? Does that sound like something that Allah would reveal, that we're supposed to fly into a rage and go crazy and overthrow the system and destroy it? And I think this is quoted by, in one of his books, Imam al-Bouti quotes this. I think it's in his book or his lessons on the history of Islamic legislation. I think he quotes Sultan Abdul Hamid, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, where he said, I've never seen a revolutionary build what he could destroy. Just things to think about. So, Imam al-Bouti continues with his book, and he says, so the last thing he said was, if this suggestion is taken seriously, it is bound to cause people to feel oppressed by this antiquated, quote unquote, meaning, Islam is just a bunch of culture and traditions from 7th century Arabia. But this antiquated heritage, which others wish to impose on society, in which everything is highly developed, advanced, and modern, right? And I recently saw a video with a guy who says he's a Muslim. He was saying, why do people do this? 7th century Arabia, no, come to the 21st century. Allah knows best what he means by that, but that's borderline kufr. You start talking like that. So, the application of the term Islamic traditions to the various rulings of Islam is not, however, an innocent mistake. Right? Maybe for people who quote it at the lower levels, maybe it's a mistake for them. But there are people higher up who are deliberately doing this. That's what the Imam is getting. There are people higher up who are deliberately doing this. They're deliberately inserting these words and these expressions and these sound bites into the Muslim mind and into the collective Muslim mind, because they know what I just said. They know that the words you use affect the way you think. So the application of the term Islamic traditions to the various rulings of Islam is not, however, an innocent mistake. Rather, it is one link in a series of attacks being waged on Islam by means of empty, misleading slogans. The primary aim behind the promotion of the term Islamic traditions is to produce an association in people's minds between the meaning of tradition in its negative sense and Islam's various rulings and precepts. When this occurs, people forget that these precepts are, in essence, principles based on sound reason and inquiry, i.e. going back to Revelation, and they become a weak point that is vulnerable to the arrows and spears of Islam's foes. Right? So once you get into that frame of mind and you start defending Islam, or just saying that Islam is traditions, it's the heritage of our fathers and our grandfathers, now you're a sitting duck. Now you are vulnerable to the attacks of Islam's enemies. The Imam continues. He says, All the precepts and legislation that Islam has brought are, in essence, principles, and a principle is something which is founded on sound thought and reason, and which aims to accomplish a specific end. Now, although principles of merely human origin may or may not hit their mark due to misconceptions on the part of their originators, right? Because there are principles of human origin, and because human beings are flawed, they don't always hit the mark. Sometimes human beings come up with very sound principles, and sometimes they come up with principles that are not sound at all, or appear sound at first glance, but turn out to be unsound over time, and so on and so forth. But unlike the principles of Islam, as the Imam continues, they never miss their mark, since the One, i.e. Allah, who established them, is the creator of all minds and thoughts. This alone is sufficient rational proof for one to be convinced of these principles and be certain of their correctness and soundness. Right? So if Allah is the creator of the heavens and the earth, He's the one who established this theology. He's the one who established these rules. He's the one who sent this down. Therefore, it's sound, because Allah is all-knowing. Allah is the creator of the universe. Allah is perfect. Allah knows us better than we know ourselves. That is sound, rational reasoning. The Imam continues. He says, "There's no doubt that if Muslims wake up from their slumber, they will find that most of Islam's principles and rulings, such as marriage and divorce, a woman covering and being maintained, and other issues of morals and manners, have been clothed in the garb of traditions. Therefore, it is only natural that they should find some people calling for the repudiation of such traditions and emancipation from the quote-unquote slavery which they impose, especially in this age of ours that is dominated by the quest for freedom of opinion and thought." And again, you just have to look at this. This happens a lot in Europe nowadays with this discussion about women covering. Oh, the niqab or the hijab. These are just traditions, right? They have no basis in Islam. It's just a tradition. And it's not unbelievers saying this. Muslims are saying this. It's just a tradition, right? They haven't looked at sort of the Ahzab ayah 59. They haven't looked at Surah An-Nur, the 21st chapter, verses 31 through to 32. But again, when you start talking about tradition, you sort of push revelation to the background. The Imam continues and he says, however, the reality is that there are no traditions in Islam. Rather, as we have seen from our examination of the earliest days of the Prophet's mission, it is a religion which came to deliver the mind from the grip of tradition. As for traditions, they are simply behavioral trends in which people get unthinkingly swept away out of the human desire to imitate. And he's making a brilliant point here. The human desire to imitate. Now, if you want to get an example of this, you can go online. You can go on YouTube or I think probably some other video streaming sites. Type in the Ash test and type in the elevator thought experiment, where they do experiments where, for example, in an elevator, people get in and they face the front of the elevator. They face the elevator door. They press the button, they face the elevator door. But they did experiments and say, what if you got into an elevator and you see people facing the back of the elevator? Well, you've never seen it before. Someone's facing the back of the elevator, and then other people get on the elevator and they face the back. What happens in these experiments is the person who's the subject of the test, just about every single case, he ends up facing the back of the elevator. He or she will end up facing the back of the elevator. Why? Because that's just human nature, to imitate. The Imam continues and he says, it is principles which must regulate development over time, not vice versa. Right? So, Islam, the principles of Islam, our theology, our law, our morality, it regulates development over time. It's not regulated itself. It's not regulated by time. So this is this silly argument that people say nowadays, oh, the age we live in, the day and age we live in, the time we live in. No. But that's the argument people use. Because of the age we live in, we have to change this law, and we can no longer believe this, we have to believe that, and so on and so forth. So the Imam finishes his statement here, the one that I've quoted. He says, as for traditions, They are just a gathering of parasites that develop by themselves in the midst of society's intellectual fields. These are the weeds which must be uprooted and from which sound thought must be freed. So that is the Imam's statement from his book. And then I just put a few notes below about some takeaways, some takeaway thoughts that we can get from this. So I said from the Imam's statement we can learn the following. Number one, Islam has to be separated from culture. The former is revelation, while the latter is simply customs and traditions that have been imitated over time. The only defense offered by those who engage in them is that they found their parents and ancestors engaging in them. One can look at Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th chapter, verse 104, and several other examples in the Quran. Culture not only has to be separated, but culture must not only be separated, but must be completely abandoned when it goes against revelation. As one of my teachers eloquently put it, culture must die so that we can live. Because a lot of people are in this situation where they're allowing themselves, even as Muslims, when they know they've been told that these cultural practices are against your religion, this is not what Allah has revealed. They doggedly stick to it. They doggedly stick to it. They say, this is our culture, this is our culture, this is our culture. And if I go against it, I don't know what people will say. You know, my cousins will say something, my neighbors will say something, the community will say something. And then they live their whole lives, terrified what people will say, and they live absolutely miserable lives because they're absolutely terrified of someone saying something. Whereas if you live your life for Allah, you're actually free. You are actually free. You do whatever you want to do because you're trying to please Allah. You don't care. As long as what you're doing is pleasing Allah, you don't care what people say. And you live a very, very happy life. You live in contentment. I'm not saying nothing bad's ever going to happen to you, but at least your heart will be content. Now, number two. Excuse me. We have to be wary of referring to Islam as a culture or a set of traditions because it clouds Islam's revelatory source. If Islamic theology and rulings are merely part of a culture or set of traditions, i.e. something passed on from generation to generation for no apparent reason other than it being practiced by people before, it can be easily attacked and subjected to calls for its reformation or outright dismissal. Because that's the thing, if something's validity is only based on the fact that it's been passed on from generation to generation, it can be so easily dismissed because it's not based on anything. And I said, here's an example of disbelievers dismissing and castigating Islamic rulings because they're said to be part of Islamic culture. And this, click on the link, this is a discussion between, I think, Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins, who are both atheists. They're both atheists, not just Dawkins. And they were talking about various Islamic traditions like the head covering for women and so forth. And they said, well, if it's just part of culture, because they said, when we attack Muslims, when we question Muslims, they say, it's part of our culture, it's part of our culture. Well, to hell with your culture. I think that's actually what Richard Dawkins says. Well, to hell with your culture. That's all it is. It's just your culture. So what? It's not based on anything. Then I continue here and I said, I would include in this term traditional Islam, right? Again, this is a term. I do not like this term. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is Orthodox Islam. They're the people who follow the Sunnah. They have the correct theology, the theology that was revealed. Because, again, on the Day of Judgment, the people of Bid'ah will be asked about the Sunnah, the way the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Look at Surah An-Nisa, ayah 115, the 4th chapter, verse 115. Right? The Orthodox Muslims are the ones who follow the Sabil al-Mu'mineen, the majority, the vast majority. They follow the Sunnah. They have the correct theology, i.e. the theology that was revealed, and they are the majority. Sunni Islam is not something that is simply passed down over the years and centuries. It is revelation. It is rooted in the book and the Sunnah. And this is the problem with this term, traditional Islam. Traditional Islam, because you have these people in the Anglosphere who call themselves traditional Muslims. We're traditional Muslims. And they keep stressing how they, unlike the cults, unlike people who don't follow madhabs and so on and so forth, that we have sound chains of transmission. Our deen, our fiqh goes back 1,000 years. It goes back to these imams and these imams and these imams. Great. I mean, that's true. That's true, but that's not the full picture. That's not the full picture. You can't say, okay, so you're the traditional Muslims because you follow the tradition. But that's not only a part of the picture. What you want to stress is that what you're following goes all the way back to the revelation. What you're following, when you follow one of the four methods, what you're following goes all the way back to the companions. And the companions, it goes back to who? The Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Goes back to who? Goes back to Jibreel, goes back to Allah. That's what you want to stress. What you're following is what Allah actually revealed. That's what you want to say. That's what you want to be thinking. No, we're just traditional Muslims. We're the Islam of old. We have the Islam that's been passed on from generation to generation. Great. But how does that stand? How does that stand in the face of this onslaught from people like Richard Dawkins or Bill Maher? How does that stand in the face of them? Because all they're going to say is, great. You have an ancient culture. Wonderful. How valid is that? It's been passed on from generation to generation. Great. I'm saying that in a very sarcastic tone. We need to stress that our religion is revelation. It's not a tradition. Third thing is Islam is not a race. Islam is not a race, and therefore it's certainly not a wise idea to attempt to conflate race with religion. And again, you see this today. People saying, "Oh, it's racism," right? So someone says anything about Islam, all of a sudden they're a racist. How is someone a racist for criticizing Islam? First of all, unbelievers will criticize Islam. Read Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 120. Read Surah Al-Imran, ayah 185. Read Surah Muhammad, the 40th chapter, verse 9. Learn about the unbelievers. Allah has said it over and over again in the Quran that they will not like you, they will not accept you, they will say harmful things about you. They hate what Allah has sent down. Go read. Read the Quran. Don't flip out when people say stuff about Islam. Don't flip out and get all shocked and surprised. You've not been told anywhere in the Quran that they're going to like you. And just read the stories of the Prophet. Why do you think prophets are chased out? Why are prophets oppressed? Why are prophets persecuted? Why are they chased out of their hometowns? Forced to flee? Why? Because they're not accepted. They're not part of the mainstream culture, or whatever you want to call it. So, now, and then call it a race and say, oh, it's racism. That's just unbelievably stupid. Islam's not a race. It's revelation. Now what I said here is, I said, therefore, it's certainly not a wise idea to attempt to conflate race with religion. And what I have here is a link. It's one of these prominent converts, one of these hippie converts that I referred to in my book. I think it's 2006, 2007, I think it is. In these Doha debates, trying to, or suggesting that the UN should conflate race with religion. Yeah, that's what he said. To conflate race with religion, because race is such an inherent part of one's identity, and so is religion. And therefore, people should be protected on religious grounds just as they're protected on racial grounds. Now, what I said in this article, as I said, racism is so abhorrent. Racism is so abhorrent and indefensible because one's race can't be changed. This is why racism is disgusting. It's entirely Allah's will and therefore completely involuntary. Right? You can't change your race. So someone to hate you for your race is just stupid. That's not your choice. That's how you were born. It's just unbelievable. Religion, on the other hand, is a voluntary matter. It's a voluntary matter. You choose to be a Muslim or a Christian or whatever. You choose. That's a choice you make. Religion, on the other hand, is a voluntary matter, and one must have one's own conviction. Faith that is based on mere imitation, as the quote from Jawharat al-Tawheed above demonstrates, is worthless. Therefore, the way that one might defend their race by saying they were born that way simply won't do when defending one's faith. Because again, someone says to you, someone criticizes you for your race, you're like, well, I was born this way. I was born to Swedish parents. I was born to Nigerian parents. I was born to Japanese parents. What do you expect me to look like? Right? But that doesn't do in defending one's faith. You can't say I was born a Muslim. So what if someone becomes a Muslim? What if someone voluntarily becomes a Muslim? What if someone is raised in a nominal Muslim home and they become committed to the faith later on in life? One can't say that they were born and raised a Muslim, that because they were born and raised a Muslim, that their religion should be above criticism or reproach or even mockery. It doesn't make sense. You cannot conflate the two. And I think, and because the guy advocating this is a prominent convert to Islam, again, this is something that I've been thinking about recently, just reflecting on and thinking about, is, again, the reasons why certain people become Muslim. Because if conviction is the number one factor, I'm going to repeat myself here because I said this in a recent podcast when I was talking about the big step. If you become Muslim and conviction is the overriding reason or the number one reason or maybe the sole reason why you become Muslim, then what should naturally follow is, because I believe Islam is the truth, it's just the truth. It doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter whether it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside or something else. Islam is the truth. I have to submit to it, and I should spend the rest of my life serving Islam, serving Allah, expressing my gratitude to Allah. That's how it should be. But if someone became Muslim for another reason, right? It's conviction plus something else, plus looking for a feeling, looking for a spiritual high, looking for that warm and fuzzy feeling inside, then the line of thinking will be slightly different. It would be something more like, what can Islam do for me? What can Islam do for me? How can Islam make me feel warm and fuzzy inside? How can Islam make me feel good? That's what it is. And what that means is, a person with that mindset, if they come across a theological point or a legal point that doesn't make them feel good inside, it doesn't make them feel warm and fuzzy inside, what are they going to do? They're going to toss it aside. They're going to ignore it. If they come across the rulings in the fatwa that say you should migrate to the Muslim lands, you shouldn't. Your faith is not safe in Darul Kufr. You should migrate to Darul Islam. Oh, ignore that. No, I don't like that. That doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy inside. And I like my good salary and my high standard of living in the United States or Canada or wherever it is. No, I don't like that. Ignore it. Don't talk about it. Mock it. Allah says in the Quran that salvation is for the believers. Salvation is for the Muslims. Salvation isn't for anyone else. It's for the Muslims and the believers. But then you have these people, ooh, I don't like that. That doesn't sit well with me. I think I'll ignore that, or I'll dance around that, or I'll interpret it differently. Maybe when Allah says that Islam is his religion, maybe he doesn't mean Islam in the sense of what was revealed to the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Maybe he means Islam in the linguistic sense, submission in the linguistic sense, which you'll find. This is exactly what you find in books like the Study Quran. We have to really, really think about this. Now, so someone, what I'm getting at is, so someone comes to Islam for a personal reason where they say, and then you'll see sometimes when these people in their conversion stories, they'll say, and then I felt, it's always about feelings, I felt that Islam was the religion for me. See, it's subjective. It's a personal thing. Islam is the religion for me, which means it's not a religion for anyone else. It's just religion. It's for me. And therefore, I don't want to preach Islam to anyone else. And therefore, I don't want to be attacked. Because this is my personal choice. This is my self-actualization. This is my self-realization. And I don't want to be attacked for it. I don't want to be criticized for it. I don't want to be questioned about it. Allah knows best. But I'm starting to think that that's what would motivate someone to say this. That line of thinking would motivate someone to say that race and religion should be conflated and seen as the same thing. Because ultimately, you want to be seen as someone who identifies as a Muslim. It's just part of who you are, and therefore you do not want to be questioned about it. And I think I don't know if I added it here as well, but also, well, we should mention this point is that another major difference between race and religion is that race doesn't affect the way you behave, because race is just race. It's just how you're born, the color of your skin, your ethnicity, your blood. It doesn't necessarily affect the way you behave. But religion does, because religion is a set of rules and it's a set of beliefs. It affects the way you behave in the world, and it's voluntary. Not only is it voluntary, it affects the way you behave. So of course you have to be open to criticism. Of course you have to be open to reproach. It's natural. So I continue and I say, and as mentioned in this post, and that was a post I did about that Muslim guy, that kid in Texas who cried clock, which was a complete setup, a complete fraud, which you can see in the article. As Muslims carry on down this route of demanding legal protection after legal protection, right? This is what Muslims are doing now, right? As you start saying, we have to conflate race with religion, and we have to see them as the same thing, and just as racism is so abhorrent, being anti a religion is just as abhorrent. We should, calling someone the N-word is just as bad as attacking someone for being a Muslim, and so on and so forth. And what I said was that if you go down this route, you will be beaten. Muslims will be beaten with the same stick. And I have a link to an article, and I mentioned this in my previous podcast about the Big Step. It's that same prominent Muslim intellectual in the United Kingdom who was caught condemning homosexuality in a video on one of these Deen intensives. And it's sometime in the 1990s. As I mentioned before, Douglas Murray did the digging around, because when he tried to defend himself, he tried to say, oh, it was youthful enthusiasm. I said it, youthful enthusiasm, which makes you think, he was 19 years old or something on a gap year. But no, Douglas Murray, a conservative in the United Kingdom who's a homosexual, he looked at his date of birth, looked at when this statement could have been made, and came to the conclusion that he was 37 years old at the time of his statement. But I mentioned this prominent Muslim intellectual because he has said, there was an article in the Telegraph, I don't know if I've linked it here, but there was an article in the Telegraph that came out of the cartoons, and he argued and said that the state, the government, should step forward and protect people from offense. It's people's right to be protected from offense. So he's playing that PC game. He's playing that political correct game, and guess what? He's being beaten with the same stick. So if we go down this route, so again, remember, these are two people who are converts advocating this. I'm not going to say their names. You can do your own research. But these are two people who are converts. And I've just presented you my theory as to why they became Muslim, or some of the motivations as to why they became Muslim. I'm not saying they don't believe. I'm just saying the other motivations for why they became Muslim, because they're playing out here. They look like they're playing out here. Because I said here, if this is taken further, right? So we say that religion must be conflated with race, right? So you just as you can't attack someone for their race, you can't attack someone for their religion. If this is taken further, to the extent that all religions are protected because they're conflated with race, and religion is seen as an even deeper part of one's identity than one's race. I think that's actually the wording he used in the video. Religion is seen as an even deeper part of identity than one's race. Then preaching Islam, and indeed any religion, will be illegal. Think about that. Because think about this: if you conflate race with religion, then you say religion is just as deep a part of my identity as my race, or even deeper. What does that mean? It means it can't be changed. In the same way you can't change race, you can't change religion. Okay, so how do you give dawah now? How do you give dawah to someone who's a Christian, or a Jew, or a Buddhist, or an atheist? How do you give dawah to them now? What if atheism becomes a religion? What if they claim a sort of religious status? So you try and preach Islam to them, and they say, you're offending me. You're attacking my identity. You're attacking who I am. You're attacking the very core of my being. This is who I am as, a Muslim, a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever it is. So what I said was, preaching Islam, or indeed any religion, will become illegal. And if Muslims, and this is why I linked to the article, The Abodes of the Earth, and if Muslims in Dar al-Kufr can't preach Islam, then they have no justification for being there. Why are you there then? So now you put yourself in Dar al-Kufr. You've complained endlessly for years and years or decades now about being offended, and you've fallen for the political correct trap. You've complained about free speech. Instead of using free speech to spread the faith, you've used free speech to complain about free speech. And now you're just going to kill off da'wah. You're going to kill off preaching the faith. Either through your own stupidity or maybe through your own deliberate plotting and planning, and Allah knows best. So I said here, is it not obvious that inviting someone to Islam can be taken offensively, as one is implying that the one being invited is wrong and unsaved, and not just the individual but their family as well? This is what you have to think about. If you're going to preach, if you're going to equate religion and race and say it's the same thing, then you're going to offend people. You're going to offend people when you give them da'wah, because they can say, "Oh, you're offending me. You're saying that my religion is wrong. You're saying I'm unsaved. This is intolerant. This is hateful. This is hate speech." They're going to use all the same words that Muslims use when they try to defend their religion. All right? And this is exactly what happened to this Muslim intellectual. Just as he complained about Islamophobia, Douglas Murray came back and complained about homophobia. You get beaten with the same stick, you get hung with the same rope. People need to wake up. Wake up and smell the coffee. So the conclusion is, let us therefore heed the late Imam's advice and understand that our religion is revelation, and we must treat it as such and present it as such. It is not a race, it is not a culture, and I would also add, it's not a set of traditions, and it's not an identity as either. It's not an identity, it's not something you merely identify as. Completely detached from beliefs. This is the, what's that organization called? Muslims for Progressive Values. They say that's them, right? These people reject the Sharia. They say we reject the revealed law. It's an invention, right? They're coming out with just complete kufr, but then they say as part of their values, we accept as Islam anyone who identifies as such, or we identify as Muslim anyone who identifies as such. So this is where Islam, the Anglosphere, is headed, where it pretty much is at this point in time. And it's only going to get worse from there. And this is like what we talked about before in my discussion with the Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali, this is what we're seeing is I would call it, it's not even slow, it's quite rapid actually. It's the creation of a separate Islam, a separate American Islam. Whether it becomes overall an Anglosphere Islam, I think that can happen, but there's definitely to be an American Islam appearing in the very, very near future. And other Anglosphere countries will follow suit. And Allah knows best. And with Allah alone is ever success. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Inshallah, we will convene again for another podcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.